The Monday agenda today is highly privileged host, Professor Ika'S Banting, who works for the Mwalimu Nyerere Foundation as the Director for Department of Unity. But we're not talking about Mwalimu Nyerere Foundation at the moment, but we're talking about Professor Ika'S personal relationship with Mwalimu. And as we all may know, this month is dedicated to Mwalimu, but even more, Mwalimu touched so many lives. We'll not be able to bring all onto the Monday agenda, but we would wish to bring as many as possible people with personal touch with Mwalimu. So tell us, you have such a rich history with Mwalimu. Is the show.
To begin with, I believe I should go back to my own background in the U.S. Because that's where I first met Mwalimu, not in his body as a person, but through his work. I grew up in Compton, California, which is at that time they would call it a black ghetto in the United States. These days everybody relates to it from the history of rap, Straight Out of Compton, Ice Cube. At that time, in the 1960s, it was the height of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement.
Right.
And I was active I was too young for the civil rights movement, but as Black Power started emerging in the 1960s, I became an activist. When the Arusha Declaration was written in 1967 was the year I graduated from high school.
Oh, okay, all right.
There weren't any African studies departments or black studies departments, but there was this craving for the knowledge about Africa. It was part of the evolution that was going on in the black community at that time, which was one of the, let us say, documents some of the reading that was going around in the black community at that time. I could just make this comment, for example, the Trinidadian Pan-Africanist, C.L.R. James, actually mentioned that the Arusha Declaration was the highest stage of evolution that revolting blacks had reached at that time. As the African American community was trying basically to define itself, and particularly with kind of like self-determination to define who we were, there was this evolution in language, from Negro to black to Afro-American to African-American. And this was happening at the same time. And then the language of this identity was Kiswahili.
Okay.
So Kiswahili became like a resistance language as well as an identity and a link to Africa.
That happened in the U.S.?
In the U.S.
Okay.
So we have something, probably you've heard of it, called the African-American holiday called Kwanzaa. And this was created by Maulana Ran Karenga. Basically, it mirrors the Arusha Declaration. So they are what they call the Nguzo Saba. And so the Nguzo Saba was Umoja, Ujima, Kujichagulia, Imani, what's the other, Kuumba. There are 7 principles which were supposed to guide an upright life for an African person in the world. If you look at the Nguzo Saba and the Arusha Declaration, you can see where there's a connection there. So as a young man in my early 20s, we started getting this influence. Ujamaa na Kujitegemea was one of the required readings that we would have in our political education class, our black studies classes, that we started ourselves in the community. Now, in this evolution of moving from black power to Pan-Africanism, I was thinking of going to work in Nigeria.
Okay.
Then I was also involved in the prison movement, the political prison movement in the United States. And George Jackson, who was a political prisoner for upwards of 20 years, was expecting to be released from Soledad prison. And in his last book, before he was assassinated, he said when he got out, he would try to go to Tanzania, because that was the only African revolutionary country that was worthwhile its salt in terms of representing, the aspirations of black people. And that kind of changed my trajectory from Nigeria to Tanzania. And so when I say I met Mwalimu, in that area, that was part of the motivation.
Okay.
And it just so happened they were having the first Pan-African Congress that was being held in African soil, was being held here in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, in 1974. Simultaneous to that, Mwalimu had sent Ambassador Paul Bomani with a mandate to recruit Africans from the diaspora to come and work in Kujenga Taifa, in nation building activities here. Okay. And the organization was called the Pan-African Skills Project. Okay. And right before I left Compton, actually, Ambassador Bomani had come and gave a talk at the Martin Luther King Hospital in Watts, which was also a black community. And I told him, I said, I'm planning on going to Tanzania. He said, Karibu sana, you know, you're more than welcome, go. You know, you need to do that. And again, you see, so this engagement with Nyerere wasn't just him as an individual.
Yes.
It was part of his intellect, his organization of the state, in his politics, and particularly as Tanzania was the real base for all of the liberation movements. And that's what I found when I got on the ground here. I found that there was this resonance. People knew who we were. Okay. Sometimes Mwalimu would even comment to me like, Ika, Waswahili wa huko wanasemaje? Okay. You know, understanding that I would, realizing that I would understand, he knows who I am in relationship to this African history. Okay. So, but it wasn't just him as a person. I found it on the streets as well. People were conscious of the broader African world at that time. So I began working with the Tanzanian Film Company. Okay. And even getting hired there was part of this position that Tanzania was taking at that time, the Pan-African Skills Project, Africa, Umoja Africa, unity, African unity not only on the continent and between states, but among people was also part of it. And as it so happened, a lot of the films we were making were of the national agenda, recording development. So I began now to see Mwalimu personally, in person, and I was a sound technician. I was a sound technician, music producer, etc. So when they opened the Kidatu hydroelectric plant, we were filming that. Okay. When they chose the Dodoma to be the capital city, we were filming that. Wow. Times when Mengistu Haile Mariam came here to visit on a state visit, we filmed that. So we started seeing each other personally, and it just so happened that the Tanzania Film Company's production office was in Msasani. Okay. So I would be catching the bus or walking to work, passing by his home, his personal home in Msasani on a daily basis, and ended up meeting some of the children who also were accessible, unlike other African countries where the children are taken away or above society. Mm-hmm. The family was very much part of the community. Sometimes you might be with them not even knowing they had that relationship. And that happened to me on several occasions. Eventually, as I left the Tanzania Film Company and started working for NGOs, we established a cooperative working relationship, particularly after he left public office. Okay. In that respect.
All right. And just to understand, so you came after the call to Tanzania. Mm-hmm. So you're born American, you're an American citizen, and then you became Tanzanian.
Yes.
Where's the connection?
Well, okay, when it actually, I was a shabik wa ujamaa. Okay. I was, you know, ujamaa, and I had a friend, Tanzanian, who was an artist intellectual. And he told me once, he said, yeah, Ika, that's all right for you, because you can go back to the States. You can escape, basically. And, but we have to live here, we're here. And I reflected on that, and then I thought, okay, yeah, there's a legitimacy to his argument. And so I said, okay, I need to link my destiny totally with the destiny of African people without an escape route. I remember once having this discussion with a long-term serving political prisoner from the United States named Dhoruba Moore. And he was talking about dual nationality.
Yes.
And I was saying, no, you know, we don't need dual nationality. Plus, the African country can't give it to us.
Yeah.
It's single nationality. And later he came to me and said, you know, I think you're right. That's like trying to escape the plantation with Harriet Tubman with a bungee cord. You know, the bungee cord which brings you back. So you have a return route. So early on, actually even before I got my citizenship, I signed a document that was going around for those of us who were working either in parastatals or in the government from that Pan-African Skills Initiative to pledge our allegiance to Ujamaa, the policy of Ujamaa and the government of Tanzania. And I signed that document early on. I mean, actually a few years after I'd been here. And then later on I applied for citizenship. And since there's only a single citizenship here, I had to renounce my American citizenship, which I did in that respect. And it was a shock to a lot of people, even people here, thinking, how could you give up, you know, Maju? You know, how could you give up America? Having done the studying and the engagement I was in the struggle there, I was more free here. I was more able to participate in the life here as a complete person than I ever was in the United States. And I've been blessed. I've been able to do things as a Tanzanian that I never would have had a chance to do as a black person from the United States of America. Notwithstanding, you have had a black president and you've had people in the State Department, etc. But they don't represent the aspirations of African people.
That's correct.
They're servants of that state, of that system. And I was able to be a servant of the people of Africa by being in Tanzania. And it fulfilled me. It also changed who I was. I had to kind of de-chauvinize myself from the American chauvinism, the cowboy ways of America that you internalize, even the self-negation as an African person growing up in a racist society. You internalize that racism as well. You know, unajibagua mwenyewe. You know, you discriminate against yourself. You have self-doubts, self-negation. And my estimation, after being here for many years and seeing other Africans coming from the West, myself and some of our other comrades, that it takes about 7 years to cleanse yourself of that Barnum and Bailey madness and the ideas of exceptionalism that are inculcated, and then understanding the true history, actually learning how to study history, learning what power is.
7 years?
Yeah, at least 7 years. And in that period that I was here, and then, you know, through personal relationships, I became part of the family. And I saw Mwalimu in a different light.
Did you ever go back to the US anyhow?
I went back once in 1977 for a very short period of time. And then after that, I did not go back for many years. As a matter of fact, the laws then were that you had to be resident here at least 7 years without leaving the country before you could apply for citizenship. And I stayed, I think, 10 years straight through without going back to the U.S. And during those 10 years, that was when things were tough. That's when there was nothing on the shelves, where you had to use sabuni ya kienyeji, I don't know, you know, you stand in line for sukari and mafuta, those types of things. But at the same time, that was the height of the liberation struggle. So that idea of solidarity and the explanation of why things were like that because we were dealing with imperialism, and we were dealing with, Tanzania was a country that had set up itself to be an example of success. So obviously, the world didn't want to see these African successes. So there was this undermining of the Arusha Declaration, externally and probably internally as well. So witnessing all of that, you become part and parcel of the struggle.
Correct.
Let me just, for example, I remember the Maandamano ya Mshikamano, which was a solidarity where we would get, you know, as workers, and I was working up in Arusha at the time, and we would go out, and there were other organizations, other places of work would go out, and this was Maandamano Mshikamano for the struggle in Mozambique and in Southern Africa, etc.
Yeah.
And it was optional that you could have contribute from your salaries a certain amount of money towards the struggle in Mozambique. I think something like 20 shillings. Then
that was a lot of money, I'm sure.
Big time.
A lot of money,
a lot of money, 20 shillings at that time.
And how much would one be earning to contribute 20 shillings?
300, 400 a month, something like that, you know. If you were part of the management, maybe 1,500 shillings.
Okay, all right.
General managers were making 3,000 shillings, so you could kind of get a perspective of what it was. Yeah, 20 shillings was a considerable contribution, substantial. But people did it. People were out doing that. Another example, let me give another example. When I was working with the Tanzania Film Company, and there was an advertisement agency called, it slips my mind now, but the product was called Sheen, which was a cleansing powder.
Okay.
And so I come with my kind of American, you know, Madison Avenue idea of marketing. And we made this commercial. And it went like, something like, mama, usitumie majivu na mchanga. Tumia Sheen kwa afya bora na kusafisha vitu vyako vizuri. And it was a kind of a hit on this particular program. Mm-hmm. Then we got a visit from the TANU at that time, saying that this commercial we have to change it. Why? Because first, it creates the idea in people's mind that for their health and cleanliness, they have to buy this product. And we're putting down traditional methods. And the other was that there was this campaign, a national campaign for health. And we're using afia, so there would be this kind of bringing together, fusion of the two things. So I went home and I tried majivu na mchanga to clean a pot in the pan. And actually the majivu and the mchanga got it cleaner than Sheen. Wow. You know, so I said, okay, now I'm learning now as well. But the idea of consumer culture, there was an awareness of that consumer culture, of creating a need for something that was an artificial need. Correct. For market purposes and profit purposes. All right. So Tanzania was this crucible of education at that time. And rightly so, because the head of state was Mwalimu, a teacher. Mm-hmm. So this when I say I had this relationship with Mwalimu Nyerere, I look at it in that complete, that totality of Tanzania, African unity, Pan-Africanism, etc.
This month of October dedicated to the founding father of the nation, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, and I'm delighted to talk to Professor Ika'S Banting, who has had a personal touch with Mwalimu. And right now we're going to deep dive slightly more onto looking at personal relationship as part of the family. You knew Mwalimu at a family level, at that closeness. How was he as a family man?
I was always amazed, first of all, of his humility as a person, and how he was able to translate that into public life. This is something that sometimes I would just see him change from being Baba, and a visitor would come, and he'd have to become president. And he was able to do that, you know, which is, that's an art. That's a lot of discipline goes into that. A lot of love, a lot of concern, also at all times, obviously for his family and taking care of them. But then there was always this overlap. The state is around you.
Yes. The continent, rather.
The continent,
yes,
is around you 24/7. I don't know how to say it, unlimited amounts of respect for every member of the Nyerere family, because I saw the pressures and them coping. I saw all of the impact on their individual lives and how they dealt with it. And to be the child of a public figure is always a challenge. Yeah. But to be the child of the wife or the nephew or the cousin or the brother of someone of the stature of Mwalimu was a challenge, which they coped with very, very well. Okay. To his credit as well as to their own. And I can say this, I was always embraced as part of the family. But they also taught me. They taught me to share, they taught me to move away from that kind of individualism into a kind of a collective understanding of humanity. Oftentimes, I would be at the dinner table with Mwalimu, and I remember being nervous and tense. And he had ways of telling stories or doing something that you would never expect him to do, just so that you would relax. I remember once someone delivered a message from him to me saying, "Ika, ondoa hofu, get rid of your fear and apprehension. You're at home." So all of this from him, through the children, through the cousins and uncles and nephews and brothers, etc., is what I experienced.
There are so many remarkable events of Mwalimu that you would certainly, or you are certainly carrying them along. But what is it, that one event? I remember you narrating to me once when I was driving by, and then there was this disabled person.
Actually, with this transition from being at home to stepping back into the role of the head of state. Okay. And leaving, there would be the officials coming from, the jeshi, from the military, the regional commissioners, for this escorting now the head of state back to the airport to come back to Dar es Salaam. Okay. And as he was leaving his home with basically the state apparatus there and entourage, there was this mlimavu, a crippled person, just outside the gate. And they move fast, because there are reasons for moving really quick. Huh? And as they're moving fast, Mwalimu sees this person and stops and gets down on the ground, on his knee, to speak to them and listen to them, what they have to say. And I'm watching this, and then I'm thinking, whoa, how this person must feel, so empowered, so recognized, to have the Mwalimu Nyerere, the head of the president of Tanzania, kneel down and bring himself down. Like Bob Marley said, bend down low, let me tell you what I know. Mwalimu was ready to bend down low and listen to this person. But simultaneously, at the same time, this is an example to all of the entourage, everybody that's there, of the type of person he is and what it means kuwa binadamu. And then the unity that actually builds in the country, in the society, and in Africa. The other thing was his work ethic. Okay. Mwalimu was a voracious reader, and he found time, when and how, but I remember once I was sitting in the Sebuleni, the living room, reading a copy of Machiavelli. which was in his library.
Okay.
And he came in, and he came, yes, and he said, when I saw Machiavelli, and so I said, have you read it? And Maratatu.
Okay.
But it wasn't that he had read just Machiavelli, Maratatu. His habit was to read books more than once.
Okay.
So I picked up that habit as well. And you more or less have to if you really want to absorb and reflect on what's there. So this is part of his work ethic, and he brought that into everything he did. The other is in the last year of his life when we were doing the Burundi peace talks. So I was able to work in the Burundi peace talks. I was working with Oxfam at that time, and I got seconded to assist in the Burundi peace talks, Oxfam GB. And it was at the time when they were also organizing this transition from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. And they were having meetings in Libya, in Sirte. And we had been going, this is patience also, humility, patience. Hours on end, Mwalimu would listen to the different parties and the different factions of the political representatives of Burundi. He would just listen to them. So these talks would go on for hours, literally, and days, trying to come to an agreement, but also allowing the Warundi to articulate their differences and get them out into this public discourse, and then we could come to some type of political agreement. And I remember on this particular time, we must have finished, 10, 11 o'clock at night. Mwalimu gets on an airplane, flies to Libya.
Okay.
Goes to a meeting there in the desert with Gaddafi, which starts at 4 in the morning, something like that.
Okay.
And then he's back in Arusha the next day to chair the afternoon sessions for the Burundi peace negotiations.
Wow.
And then this man who's 77 years old at that time is able to do this. And actually it just so happened that might have been the last or second to the last session that we had before he went to England to be treated for his checkup, which of course he never returned from that. Mm-hmm. And it put in me an understanding that if we're committed to African unity, if we're committed to the equality of human beings, then there's no retirement. Mm-hmm. It's a lifetime commitment.
Correct.
And I've tried to emulate that in my life and my work, that if I'm working for African unity, it's from the time I wake up until the time I go to sleep, figuratively and actually, even my final resting place. If I can be a footnote in the history of striving for African unity, then I've made a contribution.
Wonderful. So how do you remember his very last days?
Well, that's how I do remember them, of him working up until the last minute. I was fortunate enough to interview Mwalimu for the New Internationalist magazine.
Okay.
In, I guess it would have been December of '98, which was published in January of '99.
Okay.
Under the title of The Heart of Africa. Mm-hmm. And it just so happened that that was his last interview before his passing. And in that, he mentions the Arusha Declaration, saying that he still reads it, he still carries it around with him, and he still considers it a legitimate aspiration and document. And then he said he might boresha the Kiswahili a little bit, but there's very little that he would change in that respect. So consistency is also very important. And this is something else I picked up. And he was consistent. Personally, those last days, we didn't know they were the last days until actually it transpired. So you reflect back on them, and there was always I wish I would have done this, I wish I would have done that, But human life, time, etc., as it is, you then begin to value whatever you were able to do at that time. Then you treasure those lessons.
Yeah.
And they become even more important in your life. And this is not only with Mwalimu, but when your parents pass away, your brothers, your friends, etc. You go back into those interactions and you say, okay, at least we were able to do this. At least we were able to express this to each other, those types of things. And what lessons from that person's life can I incorporate into my life? And I think that's something that we can all actually take with us.
Absolutely. So that was basically bringing me to my almost close to the end of the program, but to pick. It's already been 20 years since Mwalimu passed on. And it's 20 years is a lifetime. So there's a generation in Tanzania which is getting into the voting era coming election next year, and they do not have a clue who Mwalimu is. They never had, some of us at least were there to, listen to him, see him, etc. But there's a generation now that does not know Mwalimu. How do we ensure that, they know him? They follow what he believed in. And this is one part of that generation, the new generation, the youth. But there's another category that I also wish to really put the emphasis on, the leaders we have today in our country. How do they remember, how do they carry the legacy that Mwalimu left behind?
I respect and I'm very happy actually to hear President Magufuli. He mentions the Arusha Declaration quite often, and it informs a lot of his work and his policies. And I think, as C.L.R. James said, that's the highest stage that we've reached as revolting black people. And it's a template. It's not set in stone. It has to grow and change with the dynamics of change in society and in the global arrangement of things. But that humble commitment that he exemplifies, actually, President Magufuli, and that dedication to work, the hapakazi too, that's the same principle. And I think if we can't emulate, but we can internalize, but that requires study. And how that can be incorporated once a person is in public office, et cetera, they know that better than I could even propose. Okay. I'm a professor, I'm a teacher, I'm a Mwalimu. Now, we talk about the youth and them understanding the history and the dynamics of Tanzania. Remember, Mwalimu articulated what the people were feeling and expressing. If the people of Africa and the people of Tanzania did not synchronize with how he articulated, Tanzania would not have been able to be the rear base on the frontline states and support the liberation organizations. Never forget that. All of the liberation organizations had representation here, if not training camps, and they were armed. Do you know what that means in terms of an African country? A young country where security and stability is like, how many coups d'etats are happening, and you have all of these armed groups here? That was the cohesiveness of the nation that allowed that to happen. So when Mwalimu spoke of unity, he was articulating that desire. Now, for the young people to understand that, it must be incorporated into the school curriculum. Our media houses have to be able to, it doesn't have to be just his speeches, but that essence. Are there films about African unity? Are there programs discussing or even dramatizing the struggles or the contribution of Tanzania? You know, Tanzanians fought and died in Mozambique, in Angola, et cetera. And we lived alongside people here. There were newspaper editors who were from Zimbabwe and from South Africa working here in Tanzania. Doctors from South Africa and other places working at Muhimbili, teaching in the schools. So the idea of the border was transcended by this Pan-African commitment. Now, are our children being exposed to that? So the question is, us as a generation of teachers, of communicators, are we response able? If you say it real fast, you say responsible.
Responsible.
Are we able to respond to that need for this continuity in that message that was lived and embodied by Mwalimu Nyerere and the people around him as well? Because, you know, it's never just one individual.
Correct.
You know, kidole kimoja haui chawa.
Yeah.
So you have to have the unity to be able to do that.
My very last remark, which is again an open floor to you. What's your call? What is it that you want as a takeaway to this program, the Monday agenda?
I would appreciate, first, the personal things are personal and private, etc. The main message is African unity, peace, and people-centeredness.
Okay.
We need to put people first before profit. And my concern is that we might be slipping to where we're putting profit and acquisition before we put the welfare of Tanzanians, Africans, and humanity. And that's the center, and that's what centered Mwalimu, that's what centers myself, and that's what should center the policies of any government, but in particular African governments. The people are first. And through that, you get your peace, equitable distribution of resources, concern for the least, bend down low, and we have concern for the least among us. And that's what I would like people to take away and study. History, if you know your history, you know where you're going. And if you don't know your history, you're lost. And in America, that's what they denied us as black people, our history. And we rediscovered it through Ujamaa, through the Nguzo Saba, through the engagement, through coming to Africa. And now you can see it's all coming together. Again, we have the African Union, which recognizes the diaspora as a sixth region. That wasn't, in my lifetime, that's a change.
Wow.
So I pass on the baton for the Vijana.
So you're watching the Monday agenda. 45 minutes of the program will never be sufficient to bring Mwalimu onto the program, to talk about Mwalimu, to talk about his rich ideas, his wisdom, the way he touched everyone's life. But again, it's the end of the program, which again opens up the next program. Until next time, October, let's remember Mwalimu, who is still the icon of Africa, not only Tanzania, and we are very privileged by God to have had such the founding father of the nation. Until next time, I'm your host, Austin Makani, and thank you so very much for watching the Monday Agenda.